Today we're going to draw some leaves. So we've gone outside, we've picked up a few leaves, we've gotten different types of oak leaves and probably a type of maple or elm, I'm not really sure. But we're going to draw them much larger. Then we're also going to draw a cedar elm and a pecan leaf. So a pecan leaf is going to be something like this. It's long and skinny, and one side is actually skinnier than the other. So we have pecan, whatever this is, different types of oak leaves, and then cedar elm. So cedar elm is going to be very similar to this. Very oblong. And then we're going to come in and draw the spikes. Next, we're going to pick one type of leaf that we're going to add oil pastel for the veins. So I'm going to pick one that might turn red in the fall. So I'm going to go with this guy, and I'm going to add the outline. And I'm going to make the vein fairly thick. Now we're going to be using some fairly new watercolors. These are semi-moist, meaning they already have some liquid in them. So I'm going to make sure that I wet the paint first. So we're going to be practicing a resist technique with the oil pastel or crayon. It will be resisting the paint because oil and water, or wax and water, do not mix. So now remember, with the tickle, I'm going to barely touch this and swirl the brush around until it looks like I am picking up some color. Now I'm going to apply my paint. And you can see how the paint starts to pull away. So as I apply the paint, I'm pulling in one direction, or flip the paintbrush in the other direction. And it's resisting, so there is a clear line where the paint is not mixing over top. Our next technique is going to be a wash. Our next technique will be a wash. So on our pecan leaf, we're going to use a green paint. So I'm going to rinse very gently, and I'm going to get some water in the green, very gently mix this up. So for a wash, it needs to be an even distribution of paint. So I'm going to go along the center and pull down. and I want it nice and even so that you can see. So nice and even. Now I can go back gently and add a little bit more. I'm going to use an oil pastel just to get the outline of my cedar elm. You can do any green, a light green, a dark green. For this one, we're going to go from a dark to a light, so we're going to do a blend. I'm going to wet my blue paint and get that activated. Now from here, I'm going to start with my green and pull upwards. Notice I'm being very gentle. Add a little bit more water. And before your paint is dry, now I'm going to swirl in the blue, and I'm going to just touch it here and slowly bring the blue down. So I want a gradient from blue to green. Now, to add more color without watering it down, I'm just getting all the excess water off. Do a little dip into the blue and just tap it on the paper to get a little extra. Same thing here, rinse, get the extra water off my brush, dip into the green, and add more green. Gentle. Now here we want to just a little wiggle the brush to mix those. All done. Rinse my brush. Now you can see it starts to puddle a little bit. This is why we don't move the paper. Let it sit to dry. Here we're going to do a dry brush technique. So I'm patting my paintbrush dry and I'm getting a color that's already wet. So I'm going to just drag the brush across the dry paper, and remember you're pulling, so keep the bristles, you know, nice and clean. And then I want to blend it out, so I'm just grabbing some orange, but getting the red in there with that dry brush technique just kind of helped that blend a little better. So we're doing wet on wet, wet on wet, so wet paint on a already wet surface. When we did our gradient earlier, it was the same process. So this time we're just taking wet paint and mixing it while it is still wet. So I did some yellow along the outside of the leaf where it's the lightest, and this time I'm going to use this piece of wood to scratch the surface. And this is called Sgraffito. Sgraffito, S-G-R-A-T. I already spelled it wrong. Look at the screen. Sgraffito. So this is Italian for scratching, or to scratch. Now I'm just using a little bit of paper towel to help soak up the extra paint, but the scratching technique should give off the texture of that rough, dry leaf. I'm gonna just clean this off so I can use it again later. And pat my paintbrush dry. So this time we're gonna really do that dry brush technique. I'm dipping it into the already wet paint and dragging it across the paper. So I want the texture of the dry paintbrush on the dry paper. It was a great starting point for the last leaf. This one I want it to just stay that way. And you can always go back and add more later. So this time I'm going back to the wash. One side of the leaf should be a little bit darker, so I'm going to do another layer on top of the dry paint. This is what we call a glaze. So kind of like a glazed donut where you can see through the icing. It's the same thing with the paint. We're glazing on top of our wash with another wash. And that way it looks darker. So with watercolor, typically we're going to build up our layers to get it darker. We don't always start with the darkest shade. Now we're going to try salt. So we're using kosher salt, which is a coarser salt. And I'm going to do wet on wet technique, but I'm going to show you a different way this time. So we're just applying clean water on top of the leaf. And then I'm using warm colors. I'm going to use some brown, orange, yellow. So I'm going to get some of this kind of brown copper color. I've got a metallic palette. I'm not sure about what you have. So I'm going to apply that down at the bottom and a little bit through the center where it's the darkest on a leaf. And then it should get lighter towards the outside. So I will be adding some yellow. So as you're just tapping it into the water that's on the paper, it has to still be wet. The colors will just run together. So this is that wet on wet technique again. I don't know if you can tell, but this is one of my favorites. And we have to make sure there's plenty of color because the salt is a chemical reaction and it's going to absorb some of the water and some of the color. So we want to make sure that we have enough. But it can't be too wet and it can't have too much paint, but it can't have not enough. So this chemical reaction will not occur correctly if it's not balanced right. So you'll have to probably practice this a few times before you get it exactly how you want it. Now I'm just sprinkling the paint or the salt into the paint. I'm sorry, or vice versa. So you just sprinkle the salt on top while it's still wet and you can see it happening immediately. Now we just leave it there to dry. So next I'm going to go back and do another layer on that dry brush. So like I said earlier, you will have to wait for it to dry. If the paint is still wet, it's just going to run together. The point of a dry brush is to get the texture of the paper and the dry paintbrush. So I had to make sure that that was fully dry. And now that I've used more of that red, it's at a good consistency. And with that, we are done for now. Congratulations, you made it. 6 techniques, 6 leaves.